So my name's Steve Heffernan. I'm a front-end web developer. I've got two projects right now. The first one is I co-founded a company called ZenCoder. We do video encoding in the cloud. So if you're looking to automate the process of converting video or do a big backlog of your older videos, like we could help you with something like that. And then the second project is Video.js, which is an open source HTML5 video player, which has come a lot out of talks like this, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But getting into it. So this is a picture of me at 6 years old. This is probably the best picture of me at 6 years old. A little later in the year, I fell out of a hammock and hit my front two teeth on the ground and killed the teeth. And they put big metal caps over my front two teeth. And then I also had a lazy eye. And to correct the lazy eye, they put a big Band-Aid over my good eye to kind of strengthen the other eyes. And then on top of that, I had a speech impediment. I couldn't say my R's. And so they put plastic tubes in my ears to help me hear better. And so metal caps, patch, glasses, plastic tubes in my ears. I was a messed up little kid. Anyway, so HTML5 video is kind of like me at 6 years old. It has the... It has the potential to someday be a fully functioning HTML tag, but right now it's got some issues. And to work with it, we kind of have to know what those issues are and be ready to patch them. So, but that's where we're going, right? So someday I do see HTML5 video as being the primary playback technology for video on the web and mobile devices. We started with... Early on in video, we had to support multiple plugins like RealPlayer and QuickTime to get all of our viewers to be able to see the video. Then Flash came on the scene, and we had that one plugin that we could use to reach really the majority of our users, which was awesome. And then now what's happening is we're moving away from the need for plugins. The browsers have basically agreed on kind of the right way to provide video in a browser, and they're building that ability right into the browsers. And so what you're going to have is the next generation of web developers who's all learning HTML and JavaScript. They're going to default to that as their first resort for playing video in the browser. But I do see Flash, sticking around. There's still a number of use cases where Flash can be beneficial, and especially right now where HTML5 is limited in areas like DRM and things like that. Obviously, there will still be room for Flash in those areas. So that's where we're going. Where we are now, we're somewhere around like 78% of user support for HTML5 video, which is pretty cool. Last year we were around 50%, and over the last 2 years, it's been about 20% per year growth. So if this continues, we'll be around 98% by this time next year, which is great. Still leaves about 22% of your audience that wouldn't be supported by HTML5, so we still have to be, aware of that. So in that case, why would you want to start using HTML5 video today? Well, it's the future, as we've talked about, so time you invest in it now won't go wasted. It runs natively. It runs natively in the browser. So what we have going on right now is with plugins, a plugin is basically an application itself. So we have two applications running, the plugin application on top of the browser application in order to get video to play. So with HTML5 video, the video is built directly into the browser, which means theoretically it should use less of your browser's resources. It should be more responsive, like it should start quicker because you don't have to load this external SWF file to get it to play. And then beyond that, you can actually do more interaction with the video inside the browser using JavaScript. So I don't know if you've ever tried to resize or move Flash around or hide and show it, but Flash doesn't like that very much. And HTML5 video is okay with that. So there's a lot of cool things you can do around that. And then finally, for the markdown purists or markup purists, you have cleaner code. So the promise of HTML5 video is that we have something like this. It's a simple HTML tag, looks just like the image tag, and just points to a video that's already been uploaded to the web, and that's all you need. You don't need an external player. It's already built in the browser, and that's all you need to get the video to play. Now, in order to support all of our users, today it ends up looking a little bit more like that, which is not pretty at all. But, hopefully someday soon we'll be at the previous version. So then the final and probably biggest and most obvious reason why you'd want to start using HTML5 video today is these guys, the iOS devices, because Flash is not supported on the iPhone, iPad, iPod, any of those, and it doesn't look like that will be anytime soon. If you look at this chart, it shows that probably around 80% of the web is available for playback through an iOS device. It's estimating H.264 video on the web, which is pretty amazing. I mean, part of that is because H.264 is the better format overall. So if you're not using H.264, if you're using one of the older formats like VP6 in an FLV container, you might be losing some or missing out on some savings around bandwidth and delivery. But aside from that, I mean, a lot of this growth is due to the iOS devices and people wanting their videos to play on those devices and going back and re-encoding their entire catalog of videos so that they'll be playable on those devices, which is great for HTML5. It pushes that along. It's also great for my encoding company. So let's dive into exactly kind of how to start working with this in the code and putting your player together. So like we talked about earlier, you start with just a simple video tag that points to a video that you've already uploaded to the web. And this can be one of three formats, and with just a single format like this, you can probably hit about 50% of your audience just with that. Then to reach kind of that 78% that we talked about earlier, everybody who has an HTML5 browser, you're going to need to provide multiple formats because of the different browsers support different formats. In order to get that to work, you drop the source attribute that we had in the original tag, and then instead you create source tags inside of the video tag. What that allows you to do is basically create a list of sources that tells the browser, hey, these are the options for you. And then the browser looks through the list and finds the one that it thinks it can play and then starts playing that video. One note on that is this type attribute. The type attribute on the right-hand side of the tag, that helps the browser know which format it is and whether or not it should even attempt to play it. It's not required, but it helps the browser. Otherwise, the browser would have to download bits of each video to figure out if it can actually play the video, which isn't optimal. And then another note is you want the MP4 version first. There was an issue on so iOS 3, which was the first version of the iPad. The iPad browser would not look past the first source in the list. It would get to the first source, check if it could play it, and if it couldn't, it would just stop. And so for that reason, it's just good practice to always have the MP4 video first. All right, so finally, talking about that last 22% that don't support HTML5, we want to provide them some kind of fallback. So a Flash player, a Silverlight player, something along those lines, a plugin. And in order to do that, it's not too difficult. If you have a player that you're using right now, you can take the exact same embed code that you're using to embed the Flash player today and drop it inside of the video tag. And so what happens here is older browsers, and we're talking Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8, that look at this, and they have no idea what this other code is. They don't know what the video tag is. They don't know what the source tags are. So they see that, and they just say, I don't know what that is, and I'm just going to ignore it. And so they go past that and just go straight to the plugin tag. So that's kind of just a nice natural way that you can fall back to a Flash player. And then with that, you'll get to basically your 99.9% whatever Flash plus HTML5 will support. Now, there's one more step that you can take. It's completely optional, but it will get you kind of that last 0.001 or 0.01%, and that's to provide basically a fallback image and download links. So you have an image that if your Flash player can't play it, then it will just show like an image, like either a frame of the video or something that says your browser doesn't support video, and then below it links that go directly to the video file itself. And so that allows people, one, who don't have Flash, so anybody who has an older browser and doesn't have Flash, maybe if your IT department is really strict and they don't allow anything, that might be a case. Or also you're talking like older Palm devices where they might have actually had video playback capability on the Palm device, but not in the browser. So they could download the video and play it, but not directly in the browser. So we're talking a very small percentage there, but if you're interested in those customers, that's how you can provide for them. Obviously, if you're trying to protect your content and it's copyrighted, this is probably not a step you want to take, because then you're just saying, here's the video. But yeah, so that's one way you can go. Question?
So we're just saying that it can go to browser, if it does not understand the video tag, it can ignore all that and go to the object?
Yeah, it's basically invisible text to the browser at that point. It just kind of completely ignores it. Okay, so other attributes, ways that you can kind of modify an HTML5 tag, a video tag, to get it to do what you want. Number of parameters. The controls attribute basically tells the browser whether or not to show the user interface of the play button and scroll bar and all that. That will turn it on or off. So, majority of the time you'll probably want to include the controls attribute. But if you're using HTML5 video for like a design element in the page, you might drop the controls attribute in that case. The poster attribute allows you to set basically a poster frame. So if you're before the user has clicked play on the video, it'll show this image. It'll show like if you wanted a frame or a title screen, you could provide that image to the poster attribute. Preload tells the browser whether or not to start downloading the video immediately once the page is loaded, or wait until the user clicks play. Yeah, so that's kind of like a responsiveness versus bandwidth game, like whether or not you want the video to play immediately as they click play, or if you want to save on bandwidth on videos. Like if you have multiple videos on a page, you probably don't want to use preload, because there's a chance one of those videos won't get played, and that'd just be wasted bandwidth for both you and your user. And in fact, the iOS devices, so Apple has blocked preload on the mobile devices in an attempt to basically protect their users from downloading extra bandwidth that they don't want. On expensive mobile data plans, you don't want to be downloading a video that you don't even realize on a page that you're viewing. Yeah, so next one, Autoplay. So it's pretty straightforward. It basically starts the video as soon as you go to the page. And again, Apple blocks this to protect their users. So on an iOS device, you actually have to touch the video to get it to play, and you can't trigger it with JavaScript or anything like that. They've blocked that. Loop will go back to the beginning once the video hits the end, and you probably will not use this, but if you were going to have some kind of looping cloud video in the background or something, that's what you would use for that. I'll come back to tracks. Width and height. Just set the dimensions of the screen, and a tip on that is it's usually best practice to set the video player size to the same size of the video, because then the browser doesn't have to do any extra calculation as far as like making it bigger or making it smaller. Just kind of that'd be most optimal. Okay, so tracks is a little bit more interesting now, because captions is kind of a hot topic in the news now. There's regulation coming down that's actually requiring captions on top of, I think right now it's like a TV content produced for TV, and then eventually it'll be like all professional content. But basically, so tracks is the method where you'll be able to provide captions on top of HTML5 video, and it's through this other element. So it's another element just like the source element, and you drop it below all your source elements and basically provide a link to a text captions file in a web VTT format, and you can kind of dig into that if you're interested in captions. Bad news is none of the browsers support this yet. This is part of the spec, but nobody has actually fully implemented it yet. There's the latest version of Chrome. I think the beta version of Chrome does have this working, but not fully in production to all the users yet. I'm hoping, because of the whole regulation that's come down, that browsers will kind of get on the ball and get this implemented. Until that point, There's other methods for getting captions. Basically, any of the like open source players out there can provide captions to your users, and then some of the HTML5 video players out there will actually let you embed a track just like that, and they'll read that information and basically they'll provide the captions themselves until the browser support it, natively. Okay, question.
Sorry, I see that you have a source attribute in there. Is there any way to do multiple tracks per one video, or is it limited to just one?
Absolutely. So let's dig into that. So you can provide multiple track elements or tags like that. You can provide captions, subtitles, and then you basically can define different languages. So like over here I have source lang equals EN, so English, and then there's another attribute that you can do label. And so what that allows is like the browser or player can then read through your track items and provide a list to the user, like select from these lists of languages for captions or subtitles. And at that point, it's kind of up to the player to figure out how to provide that to the user. But absolutely, you can provide multiple tracks. Yeah, for subtitles, captions, you can do descriptions. So chapter descriptions, chapter titles, and then there's even one for like metadata if you wanted to do kind of interactive events that are timed to the player. Again, all of this is just in the HTML5 spec right now. Nobody's actually implemented it, but that's kind of where it's all going. And then it is, yeah, in HTML5. So I mean, a lot of the other players will take a number of formats, but as far as HTML5, they're locked down to BTT. Yeah. Yeah. Is there what?
So reporting or analytics on the video.
There's not like really specific reporting. I mean, you can do things like you can track, when the user clicked play. Like you can plug into all the events, the normal events that happen on a player. So like you can check what the current time is, when it was played, when it was paused, when it finished, those type of things. You can track all using the JavaScript API. There's talk around more specific analytics where you can actually try and figure out the user experience more, like where did it have to buffer again and things like that. So, but yeah, just talk. Okay, so I have kind of simple tag builder if you're interested in kind of playing around with like the different parameters and stuff I threw together. It's basically just a form that you can trigger the different like options that you want in a video tag, and it'll generate the video tag for you. Just kind of a simpler way to do that if you want something easy. So it's a videojs.com/tag builder. Okay, so talking about the formats, quick show of hands, who went to the encoding, HTML5 encoding session earlier? Okay, so just a few of you. So they went like way deeper into this. I'll just do kind of a quicker overview so it's clear kind of what we're working with here. But there's basically 3 different formats. You have the MP4 H.264 format, OGG, Theora, and then WebM. Divided up, you're looking at kind of the open versus closed format. So the open formats are free to use, free to show to all your users, whereas the closed MP4 H.264 format, still free in most web cases. Like if you were going to display it publicly, even ad supported to your users, you should be okay. But if you were going to provide your video behind a paywall, like your users have to pay and log in to actually view the video, you may actually owe some licensing fees to the governing body, MPEG-LA. So I'm not a lawyer, so don't take any of this as fact, but if you're using H.264, which most people are, it's good to understand what the legalities around that is and what you might owe. So will we ever see kind of, forgive the cheesy graphic, but kind of peace between the browsers as far as like agreement on which formats to support? And not anytime soon that I can see. Basically, the 2 things that could possibly happen to make that work is one would be that the iOS devices would start supporting WebM. Which I don't see that happening anytime soon. Those devices have hardware built in that decode H.264 and make that possible. So in order to support WebM, they would basically have to do the same. They would have to have hardware that supported WebM in those devices. So, and I don't think Apple is actually part of the governing body of MPEG, of MPEG-LA that owns H.264. So they have very little motivation to actually make that happen. So don't see that going that way. The other way that could happen is if MPEG-LA decided to make H.264 completely free, which might be possible. You have the whole H.265 format they're working on. So maybe when that comes out, they'll make H.264 completely free. In that case, Firefox and Opera would consider it at that point. But until then, there's no official rumors or anything. So for now, we're supporting multiple formats for HTML5. Okay, so to talk about kind of the structure and terminology around formats. With any video format, you have basically three pieces. You have the container format, and then inside the container, you have two data streams. You have a video data stream, which is compressed using a video codec, and then you have an audio data stream, which is compressed using an audio codec. So when you're looking at, say, you have the MP4 H.264 format. MP4 is that container format, and then H.264 is the video codec that's used to compress the video data. And then you also have AAC, which is the audio codec. Or in that case, you could also use a MP3 as the audio codec there. But that's how those terms kind of work together. For OGG, you have the OGG container format, the Theora video codec, and the Vorbis audio codec. And then for WebM, you have the WebM video format, the VP8 audio codec, and then WebM also uses the Vorbis audio codec, which is a pretty decent audio codec. So that's kind of how those terms all fit together. If we look at general user support for the different formats, so your users that are coming to your site, like which of those actually support the different formats, it's actually kind of leveling off. It used to be that OGG had a much bigger lead than the other formats because it was the original format used in HTML5 video. So it's been around longer and it was supported by a lot more users, like older Firefox browsers. But now it's really starting to level off. On the right, you can see kind of the top line is OGG, the green middle line is MP4, and the bottom line is WebM. And you can see where WebM came on the scene and then got a lot of traction. And then you had IE9 come out that supported MP4, and so now they're all kind of going up together, especially as Chrome, which is becoming the more popular browser, is getting more and more users, and Chrome supports all three. So at this point, they're all kind of moving up together, and right now, all around about 50% of your users for each format. If we look at that kind of divided as far as open formats versus closed formats versus both, it's kind of thirds. So 1/3 support of your users will support open, 1/3 will support closed, and 1/3 will support both. And that 1/3 would be Chrome. And actually, it's about 39%. So the majority of those users will support both, but still not like a big number. Okay, so strategies as far as for you, like what formats should you support with your video player? There's basically three options. The first one being all three formats. So this is the easiest one on your player side because the player can do the least amount of work if you're supporting all three formats. If you're doing something interesting with HTML5 video, like if you're doing some of that work with JavaScript where you're moving it around the page and doing some kind of complex interaction with the video, you probably want to use all three formats because then most of your users will be able to see it no matter what format they support. If you want to then kind of cut down on your costs, because encoding the three different formats for every single video can get expensive when you're talking lots and lots of videos, I'd suggest going down to these two formats, these are the two higher quality formats. I actually used to say OGG because it was supported by more, but now that they're kind of leveling off, I think it makes more sense to do MP4 and WebM as the two, if you're going to go down to two formats, and that will still get you, 70+% of your users with those two formats. And then finally, if if really all you care about is playing video back to your users and you don't care whether it's Flash or HTML5, you can drop down to just the MP4 format. It's supported by the iOS devices and it's supported by Flash. So with those two combined, I mean, you can reach, you still reach the same number of users with video as you could with all three formats, just not through HTML5. So this is definitely, you know, an option. It's probably the more common option at this point. Even though I like to encourage people to do WebM because, you know, you can support kind of the open format in that direction, but this tends to be what the majority of people stick to. So I'll just run through some quick options to actually create those formats. There's a lot of really great professional options for converting your formats that can do like all three at the same time. But if you're just looking for like a quick free option, Handbrake is really good for the MP4 format, and Firefog is good for the OGG and both the OGG and WebM formats, and they're both free and both pretty easy to use. But there's still like a lot of, if you're using another professional encoder that can do all three, that's perfectly good as well. Then there's also ZenCoder, my company, which if you're looking to kind of automate the process or go back and convert like a whole backlog of your videos, like if you're trying to convert to HTML5 formats and you have a big backlog, ZenCoder can kind of help you with that. They paid for my trip here, so forgive the shameless plug. So content protection. A lot of people are interested in, okay, so with HTML5 video, how do I protect my video from getting downloaded and distributed in ways that I don't want? The bad news is there's not a ton of options around HTML5 for making your video really secure. It is at the level of, say, YouTube. So if you have about the same concerns as YouTube or Vimeo or one of those groups has, you can get to the same level of protection as those sites. You know, it's the same as like Flash progressive download video. Basically, both are the same, have the same ways to get at the video source. Yeah, so at that point, like the most you can do with HTML5 is kind of source obscurity, talking about like just making it not easy to find the source. You can use JavaScript to plug the source into it instead of putting it directly into your HTML. And then you can do things like limiting the access to a specific URL to certain times or IP addresses and things like that. And with that, the most you can do is basically ensure if you have a user that's logged into your application or whatever, and you just want to make sure that only that user is getting the video, you can do that. It basically ensures that like anybody who's like watching the logs or sniffing the network or something can't also get at that video. But you can't stop your own user from downloading your video in a way that you may not want in that case. So with Flash, you know, a couple steps that you might take with security was like RTMP streaming. It makes it a little bit more difficult to capture the video at that point. Still not impossible, but more difficult. And then obviously the end all is doing some form of DRM on the video, and there is talks of how to do DRM in HTML5, but it's very difficult when you're talking about these open source browsers. And the idea of like when you have an open source browser that's trying to secure something, if you can go in and look at the code and see how it's securing something, there's a good chance you can figure out how to get around that security. So it's a complicated process. Actually, Netflix has some proposals on how to get that done, and it's in discussions, but nothing in the near future as far as protecting video in HTML5. Now, there's a big difference between HTML5 video and native video on an iOS device. So when you're talking about video in a native app on an iPhone, that's not HTML5 video. That's actually using the same underlying video technology that the browser using HTML5 video does. But with a native application, you do have a lot more security because, one, people can't go and look at the code or watch the network as easily. You can do HTTP streaming where you're chunking up the files, which at least makes it harder to put it back together. And then finally, you can do AES encryption on the file, which actually kind of encrypts the file and makes it difficult to access. So that's why you see companies like Netflix and Hulu and PBS, anybody who's got copyrighted material, that's why they're providing it through a native app and not in the browser through HTML5 video. Okay, so getting back to some of the issues I discussed early on, just kind of bugs, things that you might run into as you're kind of building out an HTML5 video player. Luckily, a lot of these are less and less of an issue. HTML5 video is becoming more and more mature. The browsers have gone back and fixed things that they might have introduced early on, and it's becoming a much more stable platform than, say, a year ago. So this first item here, auto buffer preload, that talked about basically the HTML5 spec changing. The specifications, how to build HTML5 video, would occasionally change. And so like this was an issue where like the actual attribute changed, and you had to know how to support both. But this is actually probably not an issue. In fact, I would say I could probably remove that from this list now because browsers have locked down and users have upgraded to the most recent browsers enough that we don't have to worry about the specification changing anymore. And the specification has been locked down. They're not changing anymore, but they are adding features on top of it. So that's a very good thing. A couple other items. We had some issues with Safari and differences in how like Firefox would treat progress versus Safari would treat progress. And again, these aren't really issues anymore. Just kind of things that you might see built into some of the open source HTML5 video players out there. But if you're starting now working on a player, don't need to worry about it really. This last one you do still need to understand. It's the idea that HTML5 browsers won't automatically fall back to Flash in the way that I showed if you don't have a source that they support. So we talked about kind of that natural fallback. So IE6 would just ignore all the video tag and fall back to the Flash player. Well, that works for IE6, but if you're talking about Firefox and you're only providing that MP4 format, so you have one source tag and it's just MP4 and you're watching it in Firefox, Firefox, since it does support HTML5, will try and play that MP4 file, and when it can't, it will just stop. It won't fall back to the Flash player in that sense. So in that case, if you're planning on using like just the MP4 format, you want to use JavaScript to basically detect whether or not the user's browser can support Flash or HTML5. You can use Swift Object, which is a JavaScript library that will help you do that. And basically just, it's a quick check, and just one way you provide, if they support Flash, you provide your Flash embed code. And if they don't, you provide the video tag. And that's an easy way to get around that issue. So specific device quirks, we do still have to worry about a little bit. In iOS 3, there was a number of issues. We talked about the MP4 source needs to be first because it won't look at further sources down the list. So that's good practice there. The iPad had an issue where if you provided a poster, it could break playback on the iPad. And then same, there was some weird issue with JavaScript in the page where if you put JavaScript at the top of your page, it would break video playback on the iPad. But if you moved it to the bottom of the page, it would work in the iPad but break on the iPhone. It's this really weird back and forth thing that there's some hacks to get around it. If you're just using the MP4 format, that will kind of fix that, because then you can do. Early on, I showed you that tag that just had no source tags inside of it. It just had the source attribute. If you go that route, it will actually get around some of these. But if you're going to provide multiple formats, you might run into these bugs. Now, iOS 3 is also becoming less of an issue. The last estimate I saw was that it's somewhere around 5% of users, of iOS users. So of the small percentage of your users that are on iOS devices, 5% of those are probably using iOS 3. And in reality, those people are probably watching less video than the other people. And so there's a good reason to probably ignore this right now. It's good to know that you could run into these, but if you're not going to be if you don't need to be really hardcore about this, then you can probably start ignoring this now. And actually, Apple is encouraging native application developers to ignore version 3. So it's quickly being pushed out, but if you run into anything like this, at least you know that exists, and there's solutions out there that you can find. Now, Android is kind of a different story. Because of the crazy version distribution of Androids across all the different devices and across the users, about 25% of Android users are still on an older version, like 2.1 and 2.2. And Android had a lot of really annoying issues. The first one being that type attribute that I said was important for helping browsers know which versions they could play. That can actually break playback on these older devices. I don't know why, it just kind of trips it up. And so one way to get around that is obviously to not include the type attribute. If you find that a significant portion of your users are watching video on Androids of this version, just drop the type attribute and they can get around it. Or if you can dig into JavaScript more, you can actually detect whether or not it's Android and not provide the type attribute at that point. So it's one way to get around it. The other issue that was on Android is that you couldn't start the video in Android 2.2. So just getting around that can be a plus for your users alone. Basically, like you could embed a video on the page, and Android could play it, but if you touched it, it wouldn't do anything. What you actually have to do is, through JavaScript, basically you can use like jQuery and say a click on this element, on the video element, plays the video. And you're basically kind of telling Android, hey, by the way, you can actually support this video, so play it now. And so, yeah, another kind of weird issue with that. If you run into these issues with your users, there's solutions out there. You can dig into any open source player, and like Video.js, my project, feel free to kind of dig through that and see how I've fixed some of these issues and use it in your own player. It's not too complicated to get around these. Just good to know that they exist in case your users do start to run into them. And with this, hopefully, there's a new version of Android, Ice Cream Sandwich version 4, that will hopefully get a lot more adoption quickly and make these even less of an issue. So I talked about Video.js. This is my side project. It's an open source player that's kind of taken a lot of this and built it into a JavaScript library. It has like fixes for different bugs and ways that you can skin the player and fall back to Flash, and new features that you can use the same API. So you can use JavaScript. You tell the player to play through JavaScript. It will play whether it's HTML5 or Flash, which is a nice feature. And so this could be an easy starting place for you. And again, feel free to dig through the code. I've tried to comment it as much as possible so that anybody hoping to work with HTML5 video can kind of learn from the code that I have there as well. A couple other sources that can really help you out in your quest for HTML5 video. This is the first source I ever went to years ago. This is Video for Everybody by Croc Kamen, and it was kind of the first source that really showed us how to work with HTML5 video while also falling back to Flash. So it's got a lot of great resources, has a great list of which devices and browsers support which formats and how well they support them. So that's a good place to turn. Secondly is Dive into HTML5 by Mark Pilgrim. It's another great just kind of overall HTML5 site, and has a particularly in-depth overview of HTML5 and everything that goes into HTML5 video. And then finally, I did a video tutorial series on lynda.com that is a lot of what I talked about here today, but digs into some more of the specifics and does some like JavaScript tutorials. So actually kind of diving into the code and how you actually kind of create user interface using JavaScript. So if you want to create the play buttons and you want to create like the volume and sliders and stuff like that, those video tutorials can show you how to do that. It's at videojs.com/lynda. And yeah, so that's basically it. I hope that covered a lot of what you're hoping for. And at this point, I can kind of dive into some questions.
There's a lot of talk about encrypting and trying to keep things safe from people downloading your video.
Mm-hmm.
If you want people to download your videos a lot, you don't want all that encryption and everything. You want them to download them, keep them, be able to utilize them
Mm-hmm.
Having this on mobile devices, can they download things from their mobile devices and keep them as well? I mean,
You know that if you just so in the example where I showed where you had the download links below the code and below the video so that any user could click and download it. In an iOS device, if you click on that link, it will actually try and play that in the browser. So I haven't tried this, but it might be an option where if you like click and hold on the link, it will give you an option to download it somewhere. But my guess is that that's not really an option because iOS devices don't have like a hard drive example kind of thing. But I mean, otherwise, they can jump on the web and click the link to kind of download the video to their hard drive. And if you provide an MP4 format, then they can play that again in pretty much any video playback player on their system.
can you take the same video link and maybe send an email to them, or you can email that video to them? Or they build-
I mean, you can do that. I mean, you could provide like an email form. I mean, there's no like built-in way in HTML5 to kind of do some kind of functionality like that, but you can definitely like create an interface where it's like provide me your email address and we'll email you a link to this video, and then that's definitely a valid way to do it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Pretty unfair. Can't you apply the AS embedding encryption on top of that? Don't you have that flexibility to do it yourself?
You can do it in say like Flash and in a native app, but you can't do it in HTML5 because it doesn't support decoding of AES encrypted files. Like you have to be able to provide the key to actually decrypt it, and none of that's actually built into the HTML yet. They're working on actually in the latest versions of Chrome. There's a concept of so in Flash you have this option of append bytes where you can basically allows you to go down to the byte level of the video and basically feed bytes into Flash, so it can you can do things like more adaptive streaming and things like that using append bytes. And they're talking about doing something similar in HTML5. And at that point, you could potentially do something along those lines, de-encrypting using JavaScript and feeding the bytes into the player. But that's still a long way off. So not in browser level HTML5 can you do AES encryption.
I saw in slide you mentioned about the IP whitelisting. You mentioned about the geolocation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Restriction. Is it a part of the tag, or you're going to do a JavaScript on it?
Is it a part of?
Is it part of the video tag, or you're going to put like a JavaScript logic on it?
Oh yeah. That would all be. That's not part of the video tag. You would have to do it like through, basically through like back-end services. Like you're figuring out where your user is coming from, creating a specific URL that's only available like at this specific IP. And if anybody tries to access this URL from anywhere outside of your specifications, it doesn't work. So. Yeah.
How would you handle ad injection?
So basically at that point, to do ad injection, you're talking about working with the JavaScript API to say like detect when the user clicks play. You can use JavaScript to basically switch the source of the video. So like now play this source, so it plays to the ad, and then you can detect in JavaScript when the ad's done playing and feed in the original source and then start playing there. Basically, you can watch kind of like the timeline and events that's going on in the player and work with ads that way. The tough part is that there's not an easy way to block like scrubbing and skipping ahead in the video. You can do it. You can build your own controls. Like so Video.js has its own set of controls, and you could set it up to just block any kind of user interaction while the ad is playing. But if you had a big site like YouTube or Vimeo that was trying to do ads through HTML5 video, developers could find a way to get around that because the JavaScript API is just kind of open. You could find a way to tell the browser, hey, skip past this ad. So from that standpoint, it's not super secure, I guess, as far as making sure people watch the video. But that's basically the way to do it. You just kind of watch the events. Yeah.
Just to follow up, what about overlay ads that are not being specified?
Oh yeah, so overlay ads. It's all HTML and JavaScript. Like I was saying before, the video is really built into the browser now. You can interact with it with every other element on the page. And so, say with captions. For captions in Video.js, I'm basically reading the track file and then just creating an HTML div that just kind of, with CSS, I'm positioning it over the video and just like adding text in as the video plays. And so you do the exact same thing with ads in that sense. You just create HTML and use CSS to kind of position it over the video.
We're using Flow Player at my company.
Mhm.
JW Player.
Mhm.
Those two technologies that we use in Video.js.
No, Video.js is probably more at the same level as those players. So the difference there being, Video.js comes from the side of like more HTML5 first, using the video tag as your embed code kind of direction. So more kind of pro HTML5, I guess, is the way I'd explain it. And whereas like JW and Flow Player are more kind of lead with Flash. Everything's built kind of in Flash, so like plugins and things like that is all around Flash. And they're both decent, very good players. I would say of those two, I would lean towards JW Player. Because Flow Player, I don't see as much development on that, especially on the HTML5 side. But JW Player is keeping up with all the new technology and stuff. So and they're making it more possible for some of these other plugins that they have in their ecosystem to work in both HTML5 and Flash, and that's obviously important. So, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I was thinking specifically for the HTML5, what they're doing. I've seen they're just calling it Video.js. I've seen
Gotcha. Yeah. So I know JW Player, with JW Player you have a JavaScript, basically like a JavaScript that will load the player, and in that JavaScript they detect whether or not they should do HTML5 or Flash, and so they can support HTML5 just as easily. Flow Player was later to the game supporting HTML5, and I think they just kind of have it as just a fallback, like it just, yeah, so I don't think it's like as well supported as far as like being able to do other features with HTML5, but I think it's there. Video.js actually used to fall back to Flow Player as its Flash player. Now we have a custom lightweight player, but I mean, they do in some ways kind of work together. Yeah.
companies that have thousands and thousands of videos, do you see them transcoding to OGG and WebM, or are they mainly doing MP4 and Flash as a fallback?
Yeah, mainly doing MP4 and Flash as a fallback. Yeah, because you're talking like huge. At that level, you're talking a lot of expense, a lot of processor time to actually get these other formats. And if you know you can support the same number of users with both in the same way, yeah, you're going to use just that one format. It really comes down to if you're trying to do something more advanced with HTML5, like if you're going to do something, I don't know if you saw like the Arcade Fire Google like demo and things like that. In those cases, you might want to do like all 3 versions or 2 versions, do WebM also. But you're pretty safe with just the MP4 format right now. Yeah.
I was thinking if you're doing adaptive bitrate streaming, you're doing
Especially at that level, yeah.
4 more formats.
Yeah.
Big business for you, but
Yeah. No. I mean, as far as I know, nobody's doing adaptive bitrate with WebM right now. There's, I've heard mentions of it, but I don't think anybody's doing it, at least not in the production level. So, especially at that kind of professional level where you're switching bit rates, like everybody's doing H.264. So, yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, thanks everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.